What is Parliament's role in a situation like the public health crisis caused by COVID-19? Can Parliament be recalled although the electoral process has not been completed? Can the government spend money without parliamentary approval at this point? Is there any hope on the horizon for ending this current situation? Stay tuned to find out. My fellow Guyanese, my name is Brendan Glassford and you are tuned in to Clarity, where we provide clarity on legal issues that you have questions about. Before we begin, allow me to say this is an educational discussion. It is not legal advice, nor is it a substitute for legal advice. Now with that out of the way, let's address the issues that you have questions about. So the current situation, as most people may be aware, is that Parliament was dissolved in January of 2020 to facilitate the holding of general and regional elections. Now that process began on March 2nd and has not been completed up to the date of making this video. In addition to that, in the second week of March 2020, we have joined the world in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have had, up to the point of recording this video, 37 confirmed cases and 6 confirmed deaths from COVID-19. Now I know, especially in light of the COVID-19 situation and Parliament still having been dissolved as elections have not been completed, what is going to happen with our response to COVID-19? So the role of Parliament in a situation like the COVID-19 pandemic is much the same as Parliament regularly. Parliament is there to make laws for the peace, order and good governance of Guyana. So if you've watched my previous videos on the laws that we are currently using to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, they are pre-independence. There is definitely a need for Parliament to make new laws to deal with screening, isolation, quarantining, and the general handling of public health crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. But more importantly, Parliament's role as financial supervisor for the government. Now, in dealing with any crisis, money must be allotted to dealing with it. Nothing in the world is gotten for free, or whether it is medication, personal protection equipment, or testing kits, which are very important in dealing with infectious diseases such as COVID-19. Now, Parliament has a primary supervisory role in relation to finances through the Constitution. Now, Article 260 and 217 create a consolidated fund which all the revenues of Guyana go into. The general rule is any withdrawals from the consolidated fund, which is the main government bank account, has to be approved by Parliament through a budgetary process. Now, as you may know, every year Guyana has a budget, and there's a debate and there's a passage of that budget. In 2019, which was the last validly passed budget in Guyana, there was no specific expenditure for a situation like COVID-19. So what happens in those circumstances? That question that will occur to many people is, can Parliament be recalled at this time? Now, to facilitate, Parliament had been dissolved by a proclamation of the President in accordance with his powers under Article 72 of the Constitution, which allows the President to dissolve Parliament at any time. Now, the President does have power, according to Article 70, sub-Article 5 of the Constitution, to recall Parliament, but it seems to be very situational. It seems that the President can only do so after the dissolution of Parliament, but before the holding of elections. This recall must be prefaced on either a state of war or a state of emergency. Before this can be done, the President would have to either declare a state of war or state of emergency by proclamation. Now, whether this power could be used or not would center around if after the dissolution and before the holding of elections is a mandatory part of the provision or a direct trajectory part. Of course, this would be rather controversial. Now, the president using a power like this should seek to have broad-based consensus from all parties in Parliament so as to foster public confidence and public trust in how the government is acting, especially in times without the final declaration of the elections and in a time of a global health crisis. So many people who have been following what is going on in the news will notice that the government has tried to get money from foreign donor agencies to assist in its fight with COVID-19. As no parliament is currently in place to approve spending through an appropriation act, the government must find some alternative means to get the money which it requires to fight COVID-19. Now, one of the measures that is open to the government to spend money without parliamentary approval, and I must state that spending money without parliamentary approval should only be done in the most dire of circumstances. And if spending without parliamentary approval is done, the government must have regard to the effect that kind of action will have on the public trust that members of the Guyanese public place in it. Now, there is provision under Article 220 of the Constitution for emergency spending without parliamentary approval at the time of the spending through a device called the Contingencies Fund. And Parliament has gone through the process of setting up how money is to be spent through the Contingency Fund, which is a subset of the Consolidated Fund, through the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, which came into being in 2003. Now, it should be noted that the constitutional provisions relating to the Consolidated Fund were only brought in through the constitutional reform process in 2001. It was not always in the Constitution. So the Minister of Finance can make advances from the Contingencies Fund if, in his opinion, there is urgent need for expenditure. Oversight does not happen before the advances, but he does have to lay a statement of the expenditure over to Parliament once it would have been reconvened as soon as reasonably practicable. The specific provisions as it relates to how the contingency fund is supposed to be drawn on by the Minister of Finance are contained in Section 41 of the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. So let's go through the key subsections of Section 41 of the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. Now, the first thing you should know about Section 41 of the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act is that it gives the Minister of Finance the sole discretion to draw upon and make advantage from the contingency funds. Now, it also sets out criteria by which the Minister of Finance can use this discretionary power. If there is need for urgent and unavoidable expenditure for which there has been no appropriation in the budget, if there has been an appropriation but it cannot be allocated for that purpose, if a situation has arisen which cannot be deferred without injury to the public interest and there's need for spending to abate that situation. Now, another important aspect of this section is that only 2% of the preceding year's national budget can be spent from the contingencies fund, which is a subset of the consolidated fund. Now, last year's the 2019 national budget was approximately 300 billion Ghana dollars. 2% of that is 6 billion Ghana dollars. So that is the cap on which spending according to this discretionary power of the Minister of Finance can be used. Now, one of the things that we must accept is that Ghana is in a fairly precarious position with the current electoral impasse and a COVID-19 public health crisis. I do not think that we can get away from the fact that until that electoral process is determined, there is a need for spending. Now, ideally, that should be done with parliamentary approval, but that would require the recall of Parliament. Now, the easiest way for the government to be able to do that is to have bipartisan support from the other parliamentary parties. If the government cannot get that bipartisan support, or if the need is so urgent that there is no time to recall Parliament, the Minister of Finance, in his sole discretion, could make expenditure from the contingencies fund. To instill public confidence and public trust, Parliament should be recalled with bipartisan support. Now, if there is not enough time to recall Parliament, then and only then should the powers of the Minister of Finance to use money or to make advances from the contingencies fund be used. And this as well should have the bipartisan support of the other major parliamentary parties, so as to instill trust and confidence in the public that this is the best course of action to deal with monies needed to fight COVID-19. So I hope we have given you clarity on these legal issues. Until next time, take care.